The moment the host smirked, thinking he had trapped Melania Trump, he had already lost. What started as a routine interview quickly turned into one of the most explosive moments in live television history. A smug liberal host thought he could corner her with a loaded question about Donald Trump, but what happened next left the entire audience speechless. What did Melania say that completely turned the tables? Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The bright lights of the Manhattan studio gleamed off the polished stage floor, casting a dramatic glow over the set. The audience murmured in anticipation, their eyes darting between the celebrity host and the empty chair across from him. The show was about to begin, and tonight's guest was none other than Melania Trump. It wasn't just another routine political interview. It was clear from the energy in the room that something was different tonight. The air felt thick with expectation, like the moment before a storm breaks. The host, a well-known liberal media figure, adjusted his tie, flashing a confident, almost predatory smile at the cameras. He had built his career on sensational interviews, on cornering conservative figures, and on making them squirm under his carefully constructed gotcha questions, and tonight, he believed he had his biggest target yet. The audience erupted into applause as Melania Trump entered the studio, poised and graceful, dressed in a crisp white dress that seemed to glow under the studio lights. Every step she took was measured, her posture straight, her head held high. She was no stranger to the spotlight. She had stood beside Donald Trump through the most scrutinized presidency in modern history, facing relentless media attacks, public speculation, and an industry that never truly welcomed her. Yet here she was, composed, unreadable, and completely in control. She greeted the host with a polite nod before settling into the chair opposite him. No wasted movements, no nervous glances. If the host expected to see a woman out of her element, he was sorely mistaken. "Mrs. Trump, welcome," the host began smoothly, folding his hands together in what he clearly believed was a casual, welcoming pose. His voice carried the rehearsed warmth of someone who had spent years perfecting the art of deception. But behind that tone, behind that well-polished professionalism, was something else, a glint of smug anticipation. He had done his homework, or so he thought. He had crafted his questions meticulously, each one designed to slowly chip away at her image, to push her into awkward territory, to uncover a weakness he was certain existed. Melania met his gaze with an expression so unreadable it was almost unsettling. She knew exactly what kind of game this was. She had seen this before. The condescending smiles, the carefully placed concern, the calculated phrasing meant to disguise an attack as an innocent inquiry. And yet, she did not waver. The host's lips curved into what he believed to be a disarming smile. "You've had quite a journey, haven't you? From a small town in Slovenia to the White House? It must have been quite the transition." His tone was light, but the implication was clear. This was the opening move of a well-rehearsed strategy. He wanted to plant the idea in the audience's mind that Melania had somehow stumbled into her position, that she was an outsider who didn't belong in America's highest social and political circles. Melania's smile remained intact, but a sharpness flickered in her eyes. She tilted her head slightly, as if considering his words more carefully than they deserved. "America is a land of opportunity," she replied, her voice even, unwavering. "I have worked hard for everything I have achieved, and I am proud to have served my country." The audience stirred slightly, sensing the unspoken tension growing beneath the surface. The host chuckled, shaking his head slightly as if amused. Of course," he said, his voice dripping with feigned sincerity. "And no doubt, being married to one of the most powerful men in the world played a role in opening certain doors for you?" There it was, the first real jab disguised as a question, a subtle but direct challenge to her independence, her credibility, and the legitimacy of her achievements. He was implying, without outright saying, that her entire life was a byproduct of her marriage to Donald Trump. Melania blinked once, slowly. Her hands remained folded in her lap. She did not flinch, did not shift uncomfortably, did not even blink twice at the comment. Instead, she delivered her response in a voice so steady, it sent a wave of tension rippling through the studio. "My husband and I built our life together," she said, "each of us bringing our own strengths to our partnership." The air shifted. The audience recognized the confidence in her voice. The host, however, barely concealed his annoyance at her refusal to take the bait. He leaned forward slightly, changing tactics. "That's an interesting choice of words, partnership. Some would say it's more of a business arrangement, wouldn't they?" A low murmur rippled through the audience. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. This was where the real attack began. Melania's eyes met his unwaveringly. For the first time that night, she tilted forward ever so slightly, matching his intensity. "You know," she began, her tone now tinged with something sharper, something almost dangerous, "I find it fascinating how some people claim to champion women's independence, yet question every choice a strong woman makes." Silence. The audience froze. The host's smirk flickered, his mask slipping for the briefest second. And just like that, it was clear this was not going to be the interview he had planned. A hushed tension settled over the studio, the audience sensing the shift. The host, clearly unprepared for Malian's unwavering composure, forced a chuckle. It was the laugh of a man who suddenly realized he wasn't in control of the conversation anymore. He had walked into this interview expecting to be the puppeteer, carefully leading the former First Lady into a carefully constructed narrative. But instead, he found himself sitting across from a woman who refused to be manipulated. Still, he wasn't ready to give up just yet. He leaned forward, folding his hands together, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly. If Melania wasn't going to take the bait, he'd make the bait impossible to ignore. "You know, Mrs. Trump," he said, his voice still carrying that practiced smoothness, "your marriage has been the subject of public fascination for years. Some have even called it a mystery." He paused, letting his words linger in the air. "There have been, let's call them rumors, people wondering whether this was a love story or a business transaction." The words hung between them, an unspoken challenge. The audience stiffened at the audacity of the question. This was no longer subtle, this was an outright accusation. A suggestion that her entire relationship with Donald Trump was nothing more than a cold, calculated move. The host waited, watching her carefully. He was searching for the slightest flicker of discomfort, the smallest hesitation, anything he could seize upon. But Melania gave him nothing. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, as if amused. "You find it fascinating," she said, her accent crisp, "that people talk about my marriage?" She let the silence stretch for just a moment before adding, "I find it fascinating that people like you never tire of discussing it." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the audience, but the host, determined not to lose control, pushed forward. "Well, it's only natural," he said, his voice taking on a patronizing lilt, as if he were speaking to someone who didn't quite understand the question. After all, it's not every day that a billionaire real estate mogul and a supermodel find themselves at the center of world politics. People are curious, some would say. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "Some would say that your husband's personality, how shall I put this, dominates any room he walks into." It was a carefully disguised attack. What he really meant to say, what he wanted the audience to believe, was that Melania was nothing more than a shadow in Donald Trump's world, that she had been overshadowed, controlled, reduced to nothing more than a trophy wife. Melania's lips curved into the faintest smile. It wasn't forced, it wasn't defensive. It was the kind of smile that said, "I know exactly what you're doing." She leaned forward just slightly, meeting his gaze without blinking. "My husband is a man of conviction," she said evenly. "And when a person has conviction, when they stand for something, it makes people uncomfortable." The host stiffened. That wasn't the answer he had wanted. He had expected a flustered defense, a half-hearted attempt to deflect the accusation. Instead, She had flipped the narrative on him, subtly making it clear that her husband's strength wasn't a flaw, but a quality that made weak people uneasy. Before he could interrupt, she continued. "But what I find interesting," she added, her voice carrying a quiet challenge, "is how often the media obsesses over my husband's personality, yet ignores his heart." The audience reacted audibly at that. The host shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his fingers curling slightly against the armrest. Melania saw it. She saw that he wasn't expecting this turn in the conversation. So she pressed forward. "Do you know what drew me to my husband?" she asked, her tone calm, yet firm. The host opened his mouth as if to respond, but she didn't give him the chance. "When we met," she said, "it was not his money or his power that impressed me. It was how he spoke about his children, how he taught them the value of hard work and discipline, how he believed in family, in loyalty, in the American dream." She leaned back in her chair, letting those words sink in. The host's smile twitched at the edges. "Well," he said, clearing his throat, "I'm sure many would find that a refreshing perspective." A deflection? He had expected her to stumble, to grow frustrated, to get caught in his web of implication and innuendo. Instead, she had turned it back on him, forcing him to acknowledge something that people like him never wanted to admit, that Donald Trump was more than just a political figure. That, at his core, he was a man who valued family, loyalty, and strength. The audience felt the shift. They had come expecting a spectacle, an uncomfortable interview filled with awkward silences and forced smiles. Instead, they were witnessing something entirely different, a woman standing her ground. And for the first time, it was the host who looked uncomfortable. But he wasn't finished yet. He couldn't be. He had one last card to play. He set down his note cards, folding his hands together and tilted his head ever so slightly. "You paint a beautiful picture," he said. "But I have to ask, in a marriage so public, so scrutinized, so deeply tied to one of the most polarizing figures in history, how do you really feel?" A loaded question. A question designed to break her facade. A question meant to suggest that behind closed doors, behind the cameras, behind the public persona, there was a woman who regretted it all. The room went still. Even the audience stopped shifting in their seats, sensing that this was the moment. But what the host didn't know, what he never saw coming, was that Melania had been waiting for this question all along. For a moment, the studio fell into an unnatural silence. The host had delivered his final blow. A question so calculated, so deeply laced with implication, that even the audience hesitated to react. "How do you really feel?" It was a trap, one designed to expose doubt, hesitation, weakness. He wanted to force her into a moment of vulnerability, a flicker of uncertainty that would give him the viral moment he had been waiting for. The seconds stretched. The tension in the room grew heavier, a suffocating anticipation that had everyone holding their breath. But Melania didn't blink. Instead, she tilted her head ever so slightly, her expression unreadable. And then, a slow, deliberate smile spread across her lips. "How do I feel?" she repeated, her accent crisp, her voice smooth as silk. The host leaned in, sensing the moment slipping through his fingers, desperate to reel it back in. "Yes," he said, feigning curiosity. "Behind closed doors, when the cameras are off, what is it really like being Mrs. Trump?" There it was. The audience shifted in their seats, sensing the shift from subtlety to outright attack. The host wasn't asking about her life. He was implying a reality that didn't exist. He wanted the world to believe that behind the power, the luxury, the influence, Melania Trump was a prisoner. And for the first time, her expression hardened. "You ask that," she said, her voice unwavering, "as if you expect a different answer than the one I will give you." The host faltered, but before he could interject, she continued. "You sit here," she said, her voice steady yet cutting, "and frame your question in a way that suggests I must feel trapped, unhappy, regretful." She leaned forward slightly, locking eyes with him. And you do it because you can't imagine a woman choosing strength over victimhood." The audience gasped. The host's smug confidence cracked for the first time that night. He opened his mouth to regain control, but Melania was already speaking again. "You want to know how I really feel?" she asked, her voice growing stronger. "I feel proud. I feel honored. I feel grateful to stand beside a man who has never been afraid to fight for what he believes in." The host shifted in his chair, struggling to maintain his composure. "But," he started, desperate to reclaim his power, "surely you—" "No," Melania interrupted smoothly, holding up a single hand to silence him. The audience erupted into murmurs, recognizing the shift in power. "You see," she said, her voice calm, measured, commanding, "people like you ask these questions because you want to paint a different picture, one that fits a narrative that has nothing to do with reality." The host's jaw tightened, his fingers clenching around his note cards. "But let me tell you what reality looks like," she continued, never breaking eye contact. "Reality is watching my husband wake up before the sun rises, driven by the belief that he can make this country better. Reality is seeing a man who built something from nothing, a man who could have chosen comfort, but instead chose to fight for the American people. Reality is standing beside someone who believes in family, in loyalty, in something bigger than himself." The studio fell into stunned silence. The host, gripping onto his last shred of dignity, forced a strained smile. "Well, that's certainly a perspective," he said, his voice tight. "But some would say that your husband's, let's call them controversial moments, must have affected your marriage. The way people talk about him, the criticism. Doesn't that ever make you question things?" It was a weak attempt at salvaging his attack, but Melania was already steps ahead of him. Her expression didn't waver. "I've noticed something," she said, her voice laced with quiet amusement. The host hesitated. "You claim to support strong women," she continued, her tone carrying a subtle challenge. "Yet when you sit across from one, you try to convince her that she is weak." The audience erupted into applause. The host's face turned red. He wasn't used to being on the defensive, and yet, here he was, completely outmaneuvered. Melania let the applause settle before delivering the final blow. "You ask me how I really feel?" she said, her voice gentle but unwavering. "I feel grateful. Because in a world where people try to tear down everything you build, I stand beside a man who never stops building." And with that, she leaned back, serene and unshaken, while the host, visibly rattled, scrambled to figure out his next move. But deep down, he knew. The battle had already been lost. The energy in the room had shifted. What had begun as a calculated attack was unraveling before the host's eyes, and he knew it. His tactics, the thinly veiled insinuations, the condescending smirks, the leading questions, had failed to shake her. Melania Trump wasn't just answering his questions. She was exposing his intent. The audience could feel it too. A tension crackled in the air, a sense that something big was about to happen. And then, the host made his biggest mistake yet. He straightened his papers, his forced smile barely concealing the frustration beneath. His game wasn't working, so he decided to change the rules. With mock innocence, he leaned forward and asked, "Tell me, Melania, do you ever feel like a hostage?" The room froze. A gasp rippled through the audience. The implication was crystal clear. This wasn't just an attack on her marriage anymore. It was a direct attempt to paint her as a woman trapped, powerless, controlled. For the first time all night, Melania moved. She slowly tilted her head, a flicker of something unreadable crossing her expression. And then, she laughed. Not a nervous laugh, not a dismissive one, but a low, knowing chuckle, the kind that sent a shiver down the spine of anyone who underestimated the woman in front of them. "You really think that will work?" she asked, her accent smooth yet unmistakably sharp. The host's smirk wavered. He hadn't expected this. "You sit there," she continued, her tone even but dangerous, "and pretend to be a champion for women, but do you know what real strength looks like? The host tried to interject, but she didn't give him the chance. Strength, she said, her voice gaining power, is not playing the victim. It is not allowing others to rewrite your story for their own benefit. And it is certainly not sitting across from a man who thinks he understands my life better than I do. The audience roared. The host's face drained of color. He had expected timid answers, carefully worded responses, but instead, he had unleashed something he couldn't control. I was born in Slovenia, she continued, her voice clear and unwavering. I learned 5 languages. I built a career, a business, a life before I met my husband, and yet somehow, people like you still look at me and see nothing but the title of Trump's wife. The audience murmured in agreement. You call that progress? She challenged. The host swallowed hard, trying to regain his footing. I wasn't trying to... Oh, but you were, she cut in smoothly. She leaned forward now, turning the tables completely. You see, you don't ask these questions because you care. You ask them because you assume the worst. You assume that a woman cannot stand beside a man without losing herself. The crowd erupted into applause. The host was unraveling. His hands gripped his note cards a little tighter, his posture no longer relaxed. He had lost control of the conversation, and the audience knew it. You say you fight for women, Melania continued, her voice cutting through the noise. But what you really mean is that you fight for women who fit your idea of what they should be. The host's mouth opened and closed, searching for a way out, but Melania wasn't finished. So let me answer your question once and for all, she said, her voice slow, deliberate, powerful. I am not a hostage. I am not controlled. I am not trapped in my marriage. I stand beside my husband because I choose to, because real strength isn't leaving when things get hard, it's standing firm. The audience erupted into a standing ovation. The host sat frozen, knowing that no matter what he said next, the moment had already been decided. And Melania Trump had just won. The air in the studio had shifted. It was no longer the smug, controlled environment the host had envisioned when the interview began. Melania Trump had taken over, and the audience had felt the power of her words. She had flipped the script, making it clear that she was not a victim, not a shadow of her husband, but a woman who stood on her own, unapologetic, unwavering, and unbreakable. And the host? He was floundering. His carefully prepared questions, his subtle insinuations, his media-honed tricks, they had all failed spectacularly. His grip on the interview was slipping, and he knew it. He needed to turn things around. So, he did something desperate. With a strained chuckle, he forced a smile, trying to regain the upper hand. Well, Mrs. Trump, it's certainly admirable how strongly you defend your husband, he said, his voice laced with forced politeness. But let's be honest, surely there must be times when you have regrets? The audience stiffened. Melania's expression remained unreadable, but her eyes? They told a different story. The host sensed an opening. This was his moment. He leaned forward, pressing on. Regrets, he repeated, his voice dripping with false sympathy. Regrets about your life choices, about your decision to marry Donald Trump, about what it's cost you. The audience held its breath. He had crossed a line, and everyone knew it. For the briefest of moments, silence hung in the air, thick and heavy. The host, despite his arrogance, suddenly seemed to realize that he had made a mistake. And then Melania spoke. Regrets? She repeated, tilting her head slightly. You mean, do I regret not being weak enough to abandon the man I love? Do I regret not breaking my vows because the world decided it was easier to attack than to understand? Do I regret choosing loyalty over convenience? The room was dead silent. Even the host seemed momentarily stunned. Melania's voice was calm, steady, controlled, but there was something undeniably powerful beneath it. A fire, a conviction, a strength that could not be ignored. You see, she continued, her words sharp and precise, people like you don't ask these questions out of curiosity. You ask them because you hope for weakness. You hope that I will sit here and say, Yes, it was too hard. Yes, I regret standing by my husband. Yes, I regret being strong when the world wanted me to be small. The host opened his mouth to speak, but Melania wasn't finished. But let me tell you something, she said, her voice gaining momentum, her accent thicker now, sharper, stronger. I do not regret being a woman of principle. I do not regret standing beside a man who fights for his beliefs. I do not regret the life I have built, because I built it with love, with strength, and with the knowledge that when you stand for something, you will be attacked. The audience was electric. The host, now visibly sweating, shuffled his notes, desperately looking for an escape. Mrs. Trump, Melania raised a hand, cutting him off. You ask if I have regrets? She said, her voice now resonating with unwavering authority. No, but I wonder. Do you? The audience erupted. The host blanched, his jaw clenched, his confidence evaporating under the weight of her words. He had lost control of the conversation, completely and irreversibly. Melania Trump had not just answered his question, she had turned it into his reckoning. The tension in the studio was no longer palpable. It was suffocating. The host, rattled and sweating, sat frozen in his chair, gripping his cue cards like a lifeline. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He had entered this interview expecting to trap Melania Trump, to make her stumble, to force a reaction that would fuel the media's endless cycle of mockery and headlines. Instead, she had turned the tables, and now he was the one on the defensive. But he wasn't ready to surrender just yet. With an obviously forced chuckle, he leaned back, masking his discomfort with faux amusement. Mrs. Trump, he said, his voice slightly uneven despite his attempt to sound composed. I have to say, you're remarkably well prepared. Almost like you expected these questions. The audience picked up on the insult immediately. The implication that she had been coached, that she wasn't capable of standing her ground without help. Melania, however, remained unshaken. You think a strong woman standing her ground must mean she was prepared by someone else? She asked, her voice smooth yet laced with a quiet, cutting sharpness. Tell me, would you say the same to a man who answered you as I have? The host's face twitched. He hadn't expected that. Melania leaned forward slightly, her gaze piercing, unwavering. You see, this is the problem. You came here expecting me to be small. You expected me to falter, to question myself, to second-guess my decisions, because that is what people like you do to women in the public eye. You twist their words, diminish their strength, and when they do not break, you call them rehearsed. The audience burst into spontaneous applause, and the host's jaw tightened. Well, he said, masking his growing irritation with a thin smirk, if I'm being honest, many people believe you've lived a life of privilege. Some would argue that your experiences don't really reflect those of the average American woman. Melania didn't even blink. Ah, she said, tilting her head slightly. So now you wish to tell me that because I have lived a different life, my perspective doesn't count? The host, realizing too late that he had stepped into another trap, attempted to backtrack. No, that's not what I meant. Then what did you mean? Melania cut him off, her voice deceptively soft but carrying a lethal edge. The audience erupted again. The host could feel the momentum slipping through his fingers like sand. He was losing control of the interview, and worse, he was losing the crowd. But instead of taking a step back, instead of acknowledging his defeat gracefully, he made the worst decision possible. He went low. All right, Mrs. Trump, he said, forcing a sarcastic chuckle. If you say you have no regrets about your marriage, let's talk about your husband. You've defended him wonderfully today, but surely, you must admit that Donald Trump's behavior, his reputation, his past comments about women have been difficult for you. A murmur rippled through the audience. Everyone knew what he was doing. This was his last attempt, his Hail Mary, his desperate grasp for controversy. He was trying to push her buttons, trying to make her snap, trying to paint her as a woman forced to justify her husband's past. But Melania Trump did not snap. Instead, she smiled. And it was not the strained smile of someone struggling to maintain composure. It was the knowing smile of someone who already knew she had won. "You want me to sit here and disavow my husband?" she asked, her voice calm, yet brimming with controlled power. "You want me to act ashamed because the media tells me I should be?" The host said nothing, but the answer was written all over his face. Melania leaned forward, her eyes locked onto his with unflinching intensity. "I will tell you something about my husband," she said. "He is not perfect. He is not always polished. But do you know what he is? He is honest. He is loyal. He fights for what he believes in, no matter how many people try to tear him down." The audience clapped again, louder this time. "And let me tell you something else," she continued. "You sit here, on this stage, in this seat, with your camera crew and your carefully prepared notes, thinking you know my husband because of what you read about him. But I know him because of who he is, when no one is watching." The host opened his mouth, but she didn't let him speak. "I know him as the man who gets up every morning and puts this country before himself. I know him as the man who never wavered, never backed down, never turned his back on the people who believe in him. And you think I should be ashamed of that?" The host, visibly shaken, tried to laugh off the moment. "I'm simply asking," he said, his voice now lacking the smug confidence it once held, "if you've ever felt that his words, his actions, have made your role as his wife more challenging." Melania Trump did not hesitate. "Everything worth fighting for is challenging," she said. "Marriage, family, leadership. It is not supposed to be easy. But my husband and I did not choose the easy path. We chose the right one." The studio audience rose to their feet in applause. The host's face paled. He had lost. He had walked into this interview expecting to expose Melania Trump. Instead, he had been exposed for his bias, his condescension, his desperate attempt to tear down a strong woman who refused to play his game. And as the claps and cheers filled the studio, he knew there was no recovering from this. The studio was no longer just a stage for an interview. It had become an arena. The energy in the room was electric, but not in the way the host had envisioned. This was no longer his show. He had expected Melania Trump to stumble, to falter, to fall into the usual traps that had ensnared so many others before her. But she hadn't. Instead, she had done something far more powerful. She had flipped the entire narrative on its head, leaving him not as the interrogator, but as the one who was being exposed. And she wasn't finished yet. The host, struggling to regain control, forced a tight smile. He was losing his audience, and he knew it. The murmurs of approval for Melania had grown into outright applause. This was not what he had prepared for. He needed to change the tone. Fast. With an air of forced levity, he chuckled and leaned back in his chair, crossing one leg over the other in a transparent attempt to appear unfazed. "Mrs. Trump," he said, faking amusement, "I have to admit, you're quite the impressive debater. Maybe you should have been the one running for office." The audience laughed, but not at Melania. No, they were laughing at him. They saw through the deflection, the thinly veiled desperation behind the joke. It was his last attempt to shift the power dynamic, to steer the conversation away from the wreckage of his failed ambush. But Melania, completely unfazed, tilted her head slightly and regarded him with the kind of calm, knowing expression that only someone truly in control could wear. "Why?" she asked, voice steady and smooth. "Because I refuse to let you tell me what I should think? Because I stand by my husband instead of apologizing for him?" The host's smirk twitched at the edges, but he held it in place, gripping his cue cards a little too tightly. The audience was captivated now, hanging on her every word. "You see," Melania continued, never raising her voice but somehow commanding the entire room, "this is the game you and so many others like you play. You want to make women like me feel small. You want to convince the world that if a woman stands by her husband, if she refuses to bow to the mob, she must either be controlled or complicit. She leaned forward slightly. "But I will tell you something that I have learned." The room fell into absolute silence. "My strength does not come from how many people approve of me. It does not come from social media, from headlines, from scripted television interviews like this one." Her voice dropped slightly, the power behind it unmistakable. "My strength comes from knowing exactly who I am." The host swallowed. The audience burst into applause. And in that moment, everything changed. The interview had started as an attempt to humiliate Melania Trump, to portray her as a submissive wife, a woman whose identity was tied solely to the man she married. But instead, she had just flipped the entire premise upside down. She was not the weak one here. He was, and the audience felt it. The host, clearly flustered, tried again. "Mrs. Trump, don't you think the public has the right to question your husband's character? After all, he is one of the most controversial figures in modern history." Melania took a deep breath, exhaling slowly, as if deciding whether or not to allow him this final attempt. "You mean the character the media has created for him?" she asked, her voice still unshaken. The host froze. "You see, I know my husband in a way that you never will," she continued. "I see the man who has spent his life building, leading, fighting for what he believes in. I see the father who teaches his children that nothing is given, that respect is earned through hard work and integrity. I see the leader who stands by his country, even when it is easier to walk away." She tilted her head. "But you? You only see the version of him that is convenient for your ratings." The audience erupted into cheers. The host was visibly sweating now, his grip on his note cards white-knuckled. He had lost them, and Melania knew it. She straightened, her expression completely serene, as if she had never doubted for a second that this would be the outcome. "And that," she said, her voice as steady as ever, "is why you don't understand me. Because I don't need the approval of people like you to know the truth." The host tried to laugh, but the sound fell flat, swallowed by the overwhelming applause that surged through the room. And for the first time since the cameras had started rolling, he looked down at his notes and realized he had nothing left to say. The tension in the studio had reached its breaking point. The host, once so confident, now sat rigid in his chair, gripping his cue cards as if they were the last lifeline holding him together. He had lost control, not just of the interview, but of the entire narrative. The script he had so carefully prepared had unraveled before his eyes, and now he was left exposed, defenseless against a force he had gravely underestimated. Melania Trump's unwavering composure and intellect. The audience, once a mix of skeptics and loyal viewers of the host, had turned on him. The murmurs had grown louder, the disapproving looks sharper, and now an unmistakable shift had occurred. They were rooting for Melania, but she wasn't done yet. As the applause finally began to die down, Melania allowed a moment of silence to settle over the room. It wasn't an awkward silence, not for her at least. It was the kind of silence that held power, that forced people to listen. She had seized control of the moment, and now she would finish what he had started. The host cleared his throat, desperate to regain his footing. "Mrs. Trump," he began, forcing a smile that no longer masked his frustration. "Surely you can acknowledge that public figures, especially in politics, invite scrutiny. Isn't it fair for the American people to question the nature of your marriage, the dynamics of your relationship, and whether—" Melania lifted a hand, a single, graceful motion. It was enough to silence him mid-sentence. The sheer authority in that gesture sent a wave of anticipation rippling through the studio. The audience leaned in, sensing that this was the moment the entire interview had been building toward. She met his gaze with unshaken resolve, her eyes locking onto his like a steel trap. "Let me ask you something," she said, her voice calm but carrying a weight that could not be ignored. "Have you ever been married?" The host blinked. The question had caught him off guard. "Well, no," he admitted, a nervous chuckle escaping his lips. "Then tell me," she continued, "why do you believe you are qualified to question my marriage?" The audience erupted. The host's smirk faltered. He tried to laugh it off, but it was too late. The damage was done. She had flipped the interrogation back onto him. Melania let the audience's reaction settle before continuing, her voice unwavering. You see, this is the problem. People who have never experienced what it means to build a life with someone, through trials, through successes, through challenges, are always the first to tell others what a marriage should look like. The host had no response. She pressed forward. The truth is, my marriage is not for you to understand. It is not for the media to pick apart like a political strategy. It is not for tabloids to analyze like a business deal. My marriage is exactly what it should be. A commitment between two people who respect and support each other, no matter what the world throws at them. The audience was hanging on her every word. Melania's expression softened, but her resolve remained firm. People want to talk about power and influence, she said. They want to believe that love cannot exist without benefit, that a woman cannot stand by a man unless she is gaining something from it. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the room. Maybe that is because they have never experienced real love. The entire studio fell into stunned silence. The host, shifting uncomfortably, realized there was no way out of this conversation. She had won. But Melania was not cruel. She would not humiliate him, not in the way he had intended to humiliate her. Instead, she simply straightened her posture and offered him a small, knowing smile. So, I ask you again, she said, do you really believe you are qualified to judge my marriage? He opened his mouth, then closed it, because he knew the answer. And so did everyone watching. The applause exploded, this time not just from scattered pockets of the audience, but from nearly every person in the room. Some stood, others clapped furiously, and the host could only sit there, stunned, as his own audience celebrated the woman he had tried to undermine. The producers, realizing the show had spiraled far beyond their control, hurriedly signaled for a commercial break. But the damage was done. The world had already seen everything they needed to see. As the cameras pulled away and the lights dimmed, Melania sat back in her chair, her face composed, her grace unshaken. She had entered this studio as an easy target. She was leaving as a victor. The host, flustered and visibly shaken, managed to mumble something about wrapping up the segment. But it didn't matter, because this was no longer his moment. It was hers. And as Melania Trump stood, smoothing out her pristine white dress and thanking the audience with the same quiet dignity she had carried throughout the interview, the message was clear. She had faced the storm, and she had walked away untouched. Melania Trump didn't just survive a hostile interview. She dominated it with poise, intelligence, and unshakable confidence. She walked into that studio as a target, but she walked out untouched, leaving behind a humiliated host and a studio full of people who had just witnessed something extraordinary. This wasn't just about an interview. This was a masterclass in handling media manipulation, in refusing to be defined by narratives created by those with agendas. It was a reminder that real strength isn't about shouting the loudest or playing dirty. It's about standing firm in who you are, no matter the pressure. And in today's world, where the media often tries to twist reality and dictate public perception, Melania's response carries a valuable lesson. Dignity and truth always outlast gossip and deception. How many times have we seen powerful, independent individuals attacked simply because they refuse to fit into a carefully constructed mold? How often does the media focus on tearing people down instead of recognizing their integrity? Melania Trump showed us something that many have forgotten. Loyalty, love, and values are not weaknesses, they are strengths. And for those who doubt that, well, she made it clear. Their doubt says more about them than it does about her. If this story inspired you, if it reminded you that real strength is in character, not controversy, then don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share this story. Let's make sure the truth reaches as many people as possible. Because in a world filled with noise, it's time to amplify voices that truly matter.